On a late August morning in 2014, a 37-year-old graduate student named Zara Valentine stepped into a university building in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the first day of classes, and there was a big welcome event for all the new students. Zara was anxious, but also excited. After working for years in human resources, she decided to finally return to school and complete her PhD. Zara wove her way through the crowd to the sign-in table. She grabbed a name tag, then went into the main hall, where her new classmates were clustered around tables, meeting one another and enjoying some refreshments. But as Zara looked around the room, she couldn't help but notice that she was one of the oldest people in the graduate program. She'd always been a good student, but she had attended college a long time ago. And so Zara suddenly worried she may not fit in with her much younger-seeming classmates. Zara took a deep breath and steadied herself. She knew it didn't do any good to get rattled on the very first day. But just then her stomach rumbled. She had been so focused on the new student orientation this morning that she had forgotten to eat. Zara made her way to the buffet table, took a plate, and loaded it with some snacks, just as the dean of students walked on stage. Zara listened to a speech about the noble journey of higher education as she snacked furiously on mini sandwiches. Zara waited until the dean ended his talk before going back for seconds. One morning, a few months later, Zara sat inside of a lecture hall typing notes into her laptop as her professor went over the latest assignment. All of her classes so far had been inspiring, but also mentally exhausting. Her program covered a lot of ground quickly, and she was determined to keep up. As Zara's fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind was suddenly distracted from her professor's voice by the sound of people whispering. Zara stopped and glanced around her to see who was doing it. But the students in the row behind her had their heads down, taking notes too. Zara turned her attention back to the front, but minutes later, the whispering behind her started again. This time, she spun around much more quickly to catch the gossipers in the act. But it was the same students as before, still just totally absorbed in taking notes. They barely even noticed Zara. Zara stared at them, watching their eyes and hands as they typed. She wasn't sure, but something about their behavior made her feel like her classmates were just pretending to take notes, that they had been whispering and this was all just a ruse. Zara did turn back around to her laptop and did her best to try to reconnect with the lecture, but now she couldn't focus. She was far too anxious to pay attention. Later that week, Zara was walking back to her apartment near midnight after a long study session at the library. On the corner of her street, she approached a neighborhood market. Despite the late hour, a couple of people were browsing the bins of fruit out front, while a few others were inside buying groceries, and a clerk stood behind the counter listening to the radio, looking bored. Zara knew she didn't have much to eat back at her apartment, so she went inside. Zara walked along the aisles looking at pastas and breads and condiments when a strange urge suddenly gripped her. She took a box of crackers off the shelf, pretending to read the back of it, and then slipped it into her backpack. She glanced at the clerk, but he seemed to be totally oblivious, still just listening to his radio. An electric thrill suddenly flickered through Zara's body as she realized she had just gotten away with shoplifting. She tried to play it cool, but she didn't want this feeling to stop. So Zara drifted over to a different aisle and slipped a fancy mustard into her pack too. And after that, some expensive chocolate. She almost laughed at how easy this was. Her brain was buzzing. By now, Zara's bag was feeling heavy with all her stolen items, so she made her way towards the entrance like she had looked around but, couldn't find what she wanted, and then as nonchalantly as she could, she walked back out the door onto the street. And then once outside, she strolled casually down the block, and then when she was out of sight, she gradually sped up until she was full on running. Nobody came after her though, and so Zara was consumed by this feeling of total euphoria. She had never done anything like this before. Back at her apartment, Zara spread out her haul on the kitchen counter, and seeing it all there was kind of surreal. It was amazing, but also at the same time, she was starting to feel kind of disturbed, like she couldn't believe she had done this. And then Zara's euphoric high kind of came crashing down, and she suddenly wondered if she should just take all this stuff back and apologize. But she didn't, and so she just kind of sat there with her feelings, wondering what had come over her. She had never stolen anything before. But it was like tonight, some other personality had taken her over. A few weeks later, just before the school went on holiday break, Zara was back in class taking notes during another long lecture. Her mind raced as she did her best to keep up. Just then, she heard a familiar murmuring behind her. Zara tried to ignore it and stay focused on the professor's words, but the voices behind her got louder. Zara whipped around to scold whoever was being so rude, but when she did, everyone near her had their heads down, typing or writing. Nobody was making any noise. But the situation made Zara's blood boil. Here she was doing her best, while other students who clearly didn't care were disrupting the whole experience for everybody else and then pretending they weren't as soon as she looked at them. So Zara decided she was going to stop this behavior today. Enough was enough. The last time her classmates had interrupted, Zara had let it slide, but no more. Just because she didn't catch them in the act didn't mean they weren't whispering. She knew what she had heard. And not only that, she was positive they were whispering about her. Whatever they were saying, Zara felt like she deserved to know. And so, with a loud scraping sound, Zara, in the middle of class, abruptly stood up from her chair. The professor heard the noise and stopped talking and looked right up at her. And soon the entire lecture hall was turned towards Zara. Zara stared back, scanning the eyes of all the students and the professor, trying to figure out who had been whispering this whole time. Their blank gazes irritated her. They all looked guilty, but Zara refused to be intimidated. She told the whole class in a loud, angry voice that she knew what they were up to. They could keep trying to hide it, but she knew they were playing a game and she was sick of it. Zara almost pitied her classmates, how trapped they were in their characters, reciting staged dialogue and acting out their assigned roles. It was all so blatant. She couldn't stand another second of it. Zara snapped her laptop shut, scooped it into her backpack, and stormed out of the classroom. The winter streets of Boston were cold and gray as Zara hurried back towards her apartment. She was eager to get home and away from all these people she couldn't trust. But as she ran down the hallway of her apartment building and approached her unit, she froze. Her front door was already wide open. Moving slowly in case there was an intruder, Zara tiptoed to the doorway and peeked inside. Furniture was knocked over, books and clothes were scattered everywhere. The place had been ransacked. Suddenly it hit her. Zara felt like a fool. Of course she'd been robbed by her own parents. She'd given them her spare key, and they must have come while she was at class. Zara knew they were in on the same game as all of her classmates and even her professor. Zara couldn't tell what her parents had stolen, but she was not about to let them get away with this. First, Zara deadlocked her door, and then she began surveying her apartment. She had a feeling that her parents had not only robbed her, but had also contaminated the place with some sort of poison. She rummaged through drawers and cabinets, looking everywhere, when her eyes suddenly landed on the refrigerator. Zara went into the kitchen and slowly opened the fridge door. Her groceries were still there where she had left them, but she knew something was off. Zara leaned in and smelled. Then she jumped back and slammed the fridge shut in disgust. She'd have to throw away all her food because everything inside of it had clearly been poisoned. Zara then picked up her phone to call her mother, Antoinette, and after a few rings, her mother answered. And Zara told her mother that if she or her dad ever came anywhere near her apartment again, Zara would hurt them. If they wanted this to get ugly, Zara wouldn't be the one to back down. Then she warned her mother to never call her again, and then Zara hung up. 1 month later, on a drizzly winter morning in February, a psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Lean prepared to meet with Zara at a Massachusetts psychiatric hospital for the second time. Their first meeting had been 1 month earlier when Zara had arrived at the hospital, accompanied by her very shocked parents and some social workers. By the end of that very first visit, Dr. Lean had helped Zara realize that the world was not out to get her. Instead, she was clearly having some sort of mental trouble and really needed professional help. And so Zara had actually agreed to check herself into that hospital for a full month of inpatient psychiatric care. Dr. Lean diagnosed Zara as suffering from a psychotic disorder, which is a serious mental condition that causes a person to have trouble staying in touch with reality. He put her on a regimen of antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication and ordered extensive blood tests. The blood test results revealed that Zara was not getting enough of several key nutrients. She was also anemic, which is when someone doesn't have enough healthy red blood cells to carry oxygen to the body's tissues. Anemia alone can make a person's behavior erratic, although very rarely to the degree that Zara had shown. Nevertheless, after that first meeting, Dr. Lean had prescribed Zara a variety of vitamin supplements to combat her anemia, along with the other drugs to help with her mental disorder. And so now, after a full month of care was finally done, Dr. Lean was eager to see how Zara was doing. Tomorrow was her final day of inpatient treatment, and Dr. Lean was hoping that his prescriptions had helped her get back to her usual self. Right on time, there was a knock at the door, and then Zara entered and took a seat. Dr. Lean's heart sank when he saw her. Zara looked as frail as when she'd arrived. Her skin was pasty and pale, and her hair looked thin and scraggly. Dr. Lean asked Zara how she was feeling, but she just shrugged. She promised she'd been taking all of the vitamins and all the medications that he'd prescribed her, but Dr. Lean wondered if she was actually telling the truth. It didn't make sense to him that the meds wouldn't have any effect. Dr. Lean was very disappointed, but he had worked in psychiatry long enough to know how incredibly complex mental health really is. Patients respond to treatments at very different rates, and it might just take a bit longer for Zara to feel the effects of all of these medications. And so, Dr. Lean congratulated Zara on sticking with her treatment for the full month as promised, but told her that the next day her parents would be coming to take her home. He said he hoped that Zara would keep taking her medications until she fully recovered. Zara nodded blankly and stood to leave. As she did, Dr. Lean reminded Zara that she was always free to call him if she ever needed help, but Zara was already out the door and did not appear to be listening to him. The next day, Zara's mom, Antoinette, held her husband Robert's hand as they walked across the parking lot and into the lobby of the hospital where Zara had been staying. A receptionist at the counter told them that their daughter would be down soon. A few minutes later, Antoinette heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. She turned to see a nurse pushing Zara out in a wheelchair. Zara looked gaunt and exhausted. Antoinette rushed to give her daughter a hug, and when she did, her daughter's body felt like a bag of bones. Antoinette tried to be grateful that at least her daughter seemed calm, rather than hostile like before. She hoped this was maybe the first sign of improvement. Maybe her old self would return once she was settled back at home. Robert grabbed Zara's bag while Antoinette led Zara out of the building towards their car. But the drive home was very strained. Antoinette, at one point, tried to make conversation by asking Zara how the food was at the hospital, but Zara just shrugged. She said she hadn't really eaten much while she was there. Antoinette shot a worried look at her husband behind the wheel, and then a moment later, Zara told her parents that the doctors had all been gossiping about her, and the only way to stop the game was to stop eating, so she basically threw away most of her meals. Most days, Zara said she limited herself to a slice or two of bread and some water. Antoinette felt crushed. Zara's delusions had obviously not changed at all. She didn't know what to do or even where to turn for help. Eight months later, a primary care physician named Dr. Maggie Portis was studying Zara's file a few minutes before Zara was set to arrive for her appointment. Zara's story really intrigued Dr. Portis. Zara did not drink alcohol, she had never suffered a head injury, and she had no family history of mental health issues. And yet, she'd spent a month at a psychiatric hospital for delusional behavior without showing any signs of getting better. According to her family, her delusions were still as strong as ever. Since being released from the hospital, Zara had gone to a number of doctors who determined that she had a vitamin deficiency as well as a thyroid issue. Zara was given supplements to boost her iron and vitamin B, and her thyroid issue was treated successfully. But none of those treatments had any effect on her mental health. She was still totally delusional. While Dr. Portis was lost in thought, a nurse notified her that Zara and her mother were waiting for her in an examination room. Dr. Portis headed down the hall, eager to meet her new patient, but the moment she entered that exam room, she was struck by how hollowed out and desperate Zara looked. Dr. Portis introduced herself, then had Zara undress and step on the scale. Zara weighed only 99 pounds, despite being 5 foot 6 inches tall. Dr. Portis then had Zara sit on the examination table, while a nurse came and tied Zara's arm with a tourniquet, swabbed an area with an alcohol pad, and filled a syringe with her blood. Zara seemed to barely notice any of this. After the nurse left the room, Zara complained to Dr. Portis that she had been taking all of her prescribed vitamins and medications, but did not feel any better. Dr. Portis nodded. As Zara talked, the doctor suddenly had a hunch about why Zara was not getting any better. If her hunch was right, then of course Zara's meds wouldn't have had an effect, and her delusions would continue. Choosing her words very carefully, Dr. Portis told Zara that she thought she knew what might be causing her mental problems, but she wouldn't be able to tell for sure unless Zara had a procedure done. Zara's eyes lit up at the idea, and she immediately agreed to do whatever it took to make a change. She said she just wanted her old life back. Dr. Portis felt deep empathy for Zara. It was clear that she was afflicted by something that she really had no control over. Dr. Portis wrote down a name and a phone number on a notepad and handed it to Zara. She explained that it was contact information for a doctor who could perform a biopsy, which is a surgical procedure where tissue is removed from the body and then examined under a microscope. She promised Zara the procedure would be quick and painless, and it might bring her closer to solving her health issues. Zara clutched the piece of paper with both hands and thanked Dr. Portis. Then she sighed and leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and went limp with exhaustion. Dr. Portis wished Zara luck and then left them to have a moment alone. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless morning, a gastroenterologist, which is a doctor who specializes in diagnosing and treating diseases and conditions that affect the digestive system, named Dr. Simon Reed, shook his head in amazement as he surveyed the biopsy results of a patient's small intestine. In all his years in medicine, he had never seen a case quite like this one. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and Zara entered. She looked thin and very nervous. Dr. Reed thanked her for coming in and told her to take a seat, and then he asked her how she'd been doing. Zara looked away from the doctor and out the window and then down at her hands. She told the doctor she felt like her real life was behind her now. She used to feel like she was just entering a promising new chapter, being back at school to finish her PhD, enjoying her own apartment in the city, and thriving in her studies. But then everything just kind of went off the rails. She started doing these weird impulsive things without understanding why. It became hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. She couldn't trust anyone anymore either, like her parents. She couldn't trust them. She couldn't even trust herself. Dr. Reed was moved by Zara's story. He could tell that she was desperate for help, but didn't know where to turn, which was why he was so happy to be able to be the bearer of good news. He told Zara that her primary care physician, Dr. Portis, had been smart to tell her to go get a biopsy, because it led to the breakthrough Zara had been looking for. The tissue sample they had taken during the biopsy showed that all of Zara's physiological and mental symptoms were being caused by the same condition, and best of all, it was treatable. Zara would only have to make one life change, altering her diet. At the word diet, Zara's body froze. She narrowed her eyes and squinted at Dr. Reed like she was trying to read his mind. He recognized it as the paranoid behavior detailed in Zara's file. She suffered from the delusion that basically everyone was lying and no one could be trusted. But Dr. Reed promised Zara that he really was telling the truth, that this was the only way for her to get better. If she changed her diet, the delusions she was experiencing would go away. If she didn't change her diet, her delusions would only get worse. But the look on Zara's face told the doctor that she was not buying any of this. She scowled at Dr. Reed and shook her head in disgust. Then she got to her feet and moved to leave, but then stopped by the door and turned back around. She pointed a finger at Dr. Reed and accused him of being part of the game like everybody else, another traitor and liar trying to trick her with food. She told him that she wasn't going to fall for it, and then slammed the door and stormed out. Dr. Reed just sat there motionless, unsure what to even do. He was completely stunned by what had just happened. Several months later, on an overcast spring morning, Antoinette Valentine huddled in the front seat of the family car next to her husband, Robert. She felt a sense of dread hanging over them. Antoinette looked out the window at the familiar silhouette of the State Psychiatric Hospital, a sight she had seen too many times lately. But she hoped today would be the last. Her daughter Zara was finally being released following a court-ordered 3-month confinement. After storming out of Dr. Reed's office 6 months earlier, Zara's life had totally unraveled. She stopped picking up phone calls or checking in with anybody. She failed to fill out the forms necessary to continue her PhD program. She quit paying rent on her apartment and soon got evicted, and before long she was wandering the streets. Antoinette had not heard from her daughter in months until she had showed up at the family home, banging on the door in the middle of the night, acting completely erratic and strange. Antoinette tried to calm Zara down, but there was no reasoning with her. Robert had no choice but to call the police, who handcuffed Zara and took her away. Later, after Zara made more threats against them, Antoinette and Robert filed a restraining order against their daughter. Weeks after that, the phone rang in the middle of the night, and Antoinette immediately had a bad feeling. It was a nurse from a local emergency room with news that Zara had attempted suicide. She had been found alone and unresponsive, but fortunately, medics had been able to revive her. Since Zara's mental state was extremely fragile, she was being transferred back to the state psychiatric hospital, and so that was 3 months ago. But today, finally, Zara was being sent home. Antoinette took a deep breath, braced herself, and held her husband's hand as they walked into the lobby of the hospital. The receptionist told them that their daughter would be out soon. Antoinette could not stop pacing around the lobby as they waited. The last time she'd seen her daughter, Zara had been violent and disturbing. Antoinette worried that when she saw her daughter again, she would still be emaciated, or that she'd scream and throw a fit and refuse to go home. Antoinette's memory of their last encounter was still a fresh wound in her mind. But just then, there was the sound of footsteps, and Antoinette spun around. It was Zara, and she seemed like her old self, the one Antoinette remembered before all this started. Zara was clear-eyed and smiling sweetly, like she really was seeing her parents for the first time in a long time. Antoinette couldn't believe it. She rushed to her daughter and wrapped her arms around her, and this time it felt like there was actually something there to hug. Zara was a healthy, normal weight again. Zara even hugged her mother back. Antoinette stepped back and looked her daughter up and down. She was speechless. Zara had this beautiful outfit on, and her skin had a healthy glow to it. Antoinette couldn't believe such a huge mental and physical transformation was possible in just a few months. What was even more amazing was that Zara's transformation was the result of something so simple. For the past 3 months, Zara had been eating only particular foods prepared by the hospital, following the recommendations made by Dr. Reed 6 months earlier, the one who suggested Zara change her diet. And now Antoinette saw proof that Dr. Reed had been right all along, just by looking at her healthy daughter smiling right in front of her. Zara's incredible improvement was entirely due to the fact that she stopped eating foods that contained gluten, a protein commonly found in foods like bread, pasta, pizza, and cereal. Dr. Reed had discovered that Zara suffered from celiac disease, which caused her body to have a severe reaction to any foods containing gluten. Though many people are diagnosed with celiac, often as adults, Zara's condition was the worst doctors had ever seen. Zara's immune system attacked the gluten that she ate so fiercely that it damaged her small intestine. Over time, her intestine became too inflamed to absorb vitamins or iron, no matter how many supplements she took. That's why she was so anemic and thin. But even worse, gluten triggered inflammation in Zara that didn't just affect her intestine, but also her brain too. In Zara's case, inflammation caused her brain to misfire, resulting in delusions and psychosis. She starved herself intentionally and became wildly suspicious of the people around her while starting to commit crimes herself. Not because she wanted to, but because it was like her brain was malfunctioning. But once Zara started a gluten-free diet, her inflammation subsided and the delusions were gone. Antoinette and Robert were ecstatic to have their sweet daughter back. The drive home from the hospital that day was one of the happiest in their family's history. Zara was affectionate to her parents and seemed very grateful to be thinking normally again. Zara understood now that gluten really was to blame for her life spiraling out of control, and so now all she wanted to do was make up for more than 1 year of lost time with her parents. Unfortunately, though, their joy as a family was very short-lived. A few months after Zara came home, Zara accidentally ate some food that contained gluten. Her delusions returned, but this time far more intensely. Once again, Zara became convinced that her parents were plotting against her, and this time she wanted to do something about it. Driven by her paranoid hallucinations, Zara went to her parents' house and tried to kill them. Thankfully, police arrived before anybody got hurt, but Zara was sent to jail. Unfortunately, we have no information on what happened to Zara after that, but her and her family's life has been forever damaged. All because of a little protein found in a slice of bread or a plate of pasta. On the evening of Sunday, March 12, 2006, 23-year-old Rost Khan bounded up the steps of Northwick Park Hospital in London, England. He was running late for the start of a clinical trial that promised to pay him £2,000 in exchange for just 3 days of work as basically a human guinea pig. But to a recent university graduate like Rost, this was incredible money. £2,000 would be more than enough for him to catch up on his many unpaid bills and put some away as savings. But if he missed the start of the trial, he was worried they wouldn't even let him in. So even though Rost hated running, he pushed himself to sprint the rest of the way up the stairs to the second floor, and then he jogged down the dingy beige hallway to the waiting room. Once inside, he found a group of men already seated around a conference table, each with a little packet of papers in front of him. A doctor in a white lab coat walked over to him, saying he must be Rost Khan, their very last volunteer. Rost nodded, his hands on his hips, trying to stop panting. He was just grateful he'd made it. Once Rost caught his breath, he sat down at the conference table and looked around and nodded a quick hello to the other men, and then he looked down at the packet of papers as the doctor in the lab coat explained that for this trial, they'd be testing an experimental drug called TGN-1412. It was designed to strengthen the body's immune system so that it could fight off cancers like leukemia. If the drug worked, it might allow cancer patients to avoid the agony of long and painful chemotherapy treatments. And so far, TGN-1412 had been tested successfully in animals, and so now it was cleared for a human trial. The doctor proudly announced that this group of men would be the first to be given the drug to see how the human body responded to the medicine. When Rost heard this, he sat up a little bit straighter. He'd done a few clinical trials before, and none of them had felt very important. But a drug that might cure leukemia could save countless lives, and so he thought it was really cool that he got to be a part of something that could potentially make medical history. The doctor told the men that tonight, the medical staff would take their vitals and give them all the same late-night snack. Then they would spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, they'd receive the drug, and for 3 days after that, they would be carefully monitored to see if they experienced any side effects from taking this drug. And that was it. Then they'd go home and would just need to come back for a few follow-up tests. The doctor beamed as he explained that once they knew how healthy people reacted to this drug, they could then test it on volunteers who actually had leukemia. Next, the doctor started reviewing a list of bullet points about how the drug was supposed to work, and as he did this, Ross sort of tuned it out and just began looking around the table at the 7 other men sitting there, and most of them were in their 20s and 30s. But as he looked around, Rost noticed that all the eyes at the table were actually turning to him now. It took a moment for him to realize that the doctor had actually asked Rost a question and was waiting for the answer. Sheepishly, he apologized and then asked the doctor to please repeat himself. The doctor cleared his voice, and then he said again what Rost had not heard. He said there were risks involved in this trial, real risks. Test subjects could possibly break out in hives, or even go into a life-threatening anaphylactic shock. The doctor then turned to Rost and asked if those risks gave him any second thoughts about joining this experiment. But Rost just kind of shrugged like it was no big deal, because for him, at all the trials he had been at, doctors always sounded this way, talking about the risks as being so bad. Are you sure you want to proceed? But honestly, Rost had already made up his mind. Besides, the trial had already been approved by the government, and all the participants were already in a hospital, so if something went wrong, they were in the right place. So Rost said, yep, no second thoughts. After Rost gave his approval, along with the other men at the table, the doctor began splitting the men into 2 groups of 4. Rost was sent with 3 other men to a place the doctor called Trial Bay 1, while the other 4 participants headed to Trial Bay 2. Rost followed his group into a big, white-walled room with 4 hospital beds. A desk and some cabinets had been shoved into the corner of the room, suggesting the room was normally used as an office. But tonight, it would be Trial Bay 1, complete with patient privacy curtains hanging from the ceiling. Rost and the other patients settled into their hospital bed inside of their curtained cubicles and waited for their snacks. And then after that, around 10 p.m., the lights went out, and Rost tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Rost woke up when a nurse called out good morning to the whole group and then flicked on the overhead lights. It was 7:30 a.m., which meant they had half an hour before the trial officially started. Rost stumbled out of bed and made his way to the bathroom down the hall. He wanted to change out of his pajamas and into some sweatpants before the trial actually got started. And after changing, when he got back to the trial bay, all of the curtains were now pushed back so that the room was now one big open space again. The nurse then asked Rost to please climb back into his bed, and then she explained that she was about to hook him up to a heart rate monitor. That way, nurses and trial leaders could monitor any cardiac symptoms while he was on this medication. While the nurse taped wires to Rost's chest, a man entered the room and introduced himself as Dr. Daniel Bradford. He explained that he was the lead doctor on the trial and that the dose of TGN 1412 they'd be receiving was scaled back dramatically from the highest dose they tried during animal testing. This way, the men would only get a tiny fraction of the animal dose. Dr. Bradford said that each of them would get an injection in their arms. One volunteer would be injected every 10 minutes until they had all been infused. However, only 6 of the 8 volunteers would actually receive the experimental drug. The other 2 volunteers would just be receiving a placebo, like sugar water, just for comparison purposes. Nobody, not even Dr. Bradford himself, would know who received the drug and who didn't. Rost knew this was completely normal in medical research, and it reminded him that these researchers were very serious. When the clock finally struck 8 a.m. and it was time to start, Rost watched as a nurse gave the first infusion to the patient in the bed that was next to Rost, a man whose name was David. David had told Rost the night before that he was getting married in a few months, and like everyone else in the trial, he'd signed up to make some quick cash. He wanted to pay off his credit card debt before starting this brand new life with his fiancée. The nurse slid an IV needle into David's arm and then hooked the IV tube up to a small machine. She turned it on, and then a clear liquid began flowing out of the machine and down the tube into David's arm. She told David to relax until the bag of fluid was empty, and then she looked across the bed to Rost and told him that she'd start his infusion in precisely 10 minutes at 8:10 a.m. As Rost waited for his turn, he grabbed a book off the bedside table and flipped through the pages, but he couldn't concentrate enough to actually read. He kept stealing glances at David to see if, maybe David was negatively reacting, but Rost was pleased to see David looked perfectly calm. At 8:10 a.m., the nurse came to Rost's bedside, and for some reason, Rost's stomach began fluttering with nerves. He told himself everything was fine and tried to look nonchalant as the nurse wiped the inside of his elbow with antiseptic and then stuck him with the IV needle. Rost began looking around the room to distract himself. The liquid drug felt cool as it flowed into his forearm and up into his shoulder. He actually shivered a bit, trying his best not to move. And then finally, he leaned back against the pillows on his hospital bed. The injection was over. At 8:20 a.m., so right after Rost's injection ended, the nurse began administering the drug to the volunteer on Rost's other side. Rost couldn't remember this man's name. All he knew is that he was an actor who had recently come back from Los Angeles, California on a vacation. And the nurse had just finished hooking up the IV when David, the first patient to receive the infusion, called out to her. David draped one arm across his eyes and told the nurse he had a migraine. The nurse told David she'd be right back, and then she walked out of the trial bay, and then a minute later, she came back with just a cold towel and laid it across David's forehead, and then apologized to him. She told him that they couldn't give him any kind of pain reliever since it might affect the drug trial. Rost felt terrible for David, who just groaned and pressed the towel against his eyelids. And as Rost stared at David, Rost just hoped he wouldn't develop a migraine too. And so far, he felt fine. But the more he began to think about it, the more convinced he became that a migraine was actually forming. Rost began to feel panic rise in his chest, but a few minutes went by and his head actually felt basically fine. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. 25 more minutes ticked by, and at that point, all 4 of the volunteers in Rost's trial bay were hooked up to their IVs. Rost still felt fine, but David's migraine seemed to be getting much, much worse. Rost could see that David was sweating now. His skin had turned reddish, and David said he felt like he was burning up. Suddenly, David sat up just long enough to rip his shirt off, and then he collapsed back onto his bed, complaining about stabbing pain in his head. At this point, Rost was finding it impossible to distract himself. Around the room, everyone except for David seemed to be doing fine, but in his gut, Rost felt like something was wrong here. At 8:50 a.m., Dr. Bradford sat inside of Trial Bay 2, so not the trial bay that Rost was a part of, and the doctor sat next to volunteer number 6. And as he inserted an IV into the volunteer's arm, the nurse from Trial Bay 1 strode into the room and asked to speak with Dr. Bradford in private. The doctor stepped into the hallway with her and was surprised to hear that 3 of the volunteers in Bay 1 were experiencing migraines and pain in their lower backs. 2 of them were also running high temperatures and had begun vomiting. The 3rd volunteer was racked with chills and was shaking so badly it almost looked like he had hypothermia. Dr. Bradford immediately rushed past the nurse and hurried down the hallway to see what was going on in Trial Bay 1. The drug, TGN-1412, had tested so well in animals that he had complete confidence that today's trial would go smoothly. But when Dr. Bradford burst into Bay 1, he found a truly chaotic scene. David was writhing around in his bed, his body drenched in sweat. Meanwhile, 2 other volunteers were slumped over, vomiting into yellow biohazard bags. Like David, they were red and flushed and dripping with sweat. Then the smell of urine hit Dr. Bradford, and he realized the bed sheets around the room were wet with more than just sweat. Suddenly, the volunteer in bed number 3 sprang up and screamed that he wanted to go home. Before Dr. Bradford realized what was happening, the man tore the IV from his arm and made a dash for the door. Horrified, Dr. Bradford went running after him. The doctor finally caught up with the patient halfway down the hall. Dr. Bradford coaxed the man back into his bed, explaining that at this point, they couldn't let him leave for safety reasons. The patient would be putting his own health at risk, and besides, he seemed too weak to even make it out the front door of the building. Dr. Bradford looked around, totally stunned at Trial Bay 1. Vomit and urine were everywhere, and he could barely hear himself think over all the shouting. He'd been involved in over 300 clinical trials over the years, and he'd even volunteered himself in several clinical trials back when he was in med school. And in all that time, he had never seen this level of chaos and misery. But Dr. Bradford could not dwell on that now. 2 of the patients in the ward had bright red faces, and he could hear their monitor alarms chirping. The 2 volunteers were going into shock, which meant their organs weren't getting enough blood. If Dr. Bradford didn't act fast, they could have permanent organ damage, or they could even die. The nurses started pulling the curtain dividers around the beds to give the men and the medical team some privacy. Dr. Bradford immediately began ordering drugs that would help stabilize the patients. As he worked, he glanced up, and his eyes settled on volunteer number 2. His name was Rost Khan, one of their youngest volunteers. And unlike just about all the other volunteers, Rost seemed totally fine, although he had a terrified look on his face. 3 hours later, Rost still sat on his hospital bed, feeling absolutely horrified. The last thing he'd seen as the curtains were drawn around David was the stricken look on his face. Then, Rost had been forced to just listen for 3 hours as David and the other volunteers cried and screamed and vomited, filling the air with this awful smell. It sounded like they were fighting for their lives. Rost felt invisible as he heard nurses racing around the room, tending to the other 3 volunteers. He could hear similar screams coming from Trial Bay 2 next door as well. And all this time, Rost was thinking any second he was going to get sick like everybody else. Then, Rost heard footsteps approaching his bed. A nurse pulled back the curtains, and for the first time since that morning, he was able to see beyond his tiny cubicle. The other patients were still hidden behind their own privacy curtains, but he could see bodily fluids on the floor and walls, which explained the smell that would not go away. Across the room, somebody in a lab coat was tying up a yellow biohazard bag and rushing it out of the room. The nurse took the IV out of Rost's arm and removed the wires from his chest and told him he was safe. She said he should go grab some food in a neighboring conference room, and someone would be in shortly to explain what was happening. Rost was very shaken, but hearing the nurse tell him that everything was okay made relief flood over him so quickly that he almost felt lightheaded. But mostly what Rost felt is he was just so eager to get out of this foul-smelling room. Slowly, Rost got out of the bed and moved out the door and down the hallway to the conference room next door. There were some nice sandwiches on the table, which seemed to indicate that there had been a really nice catering order that had been arranged right before all this mayhem broke out in the trial base, because it had been totally untouched. But Rost was not hungry. He was just too rattled by what had just happened. So he just stood there, waiting for what seemed like forever. At first, he could still hear the blood-curdling wails coming from the other volunteers, but as he waited, the horrible sounds died down. Finally, around 12:30 p.m., a nurse entered the conference room and told Rost to collect his things. He was being sent home. He nodded and followed her back to the trial bay. But to his surprise, all of the patients were now gone. The bay was deathly quiet. Rost felt very uneasy as he collected his wallet and book from the nightstand. He just kept looking around the room, wondering where the volunteers had been taken, and whether they would even be okay. Around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Dr. Ganesh Sundaralingam entered the intensive care unit at Northwick Park, even though it was supposed to be his night off. In the middle of having dinner with his wife that night, he'd gotten a call from Dr. Bradford that they needed his help tonight treating some critically ill patients. And then he'd been shocked as Dr. Bradford explained that 6 volunteers from that day's clinical trial were in the intensive care unit, all in truly desperate shape. Dr. Bradford explained that they were the first people ever to receive the drug TGN 1412, so nobody knew why the patients were having such strong reactions. Dr. Bradford was basically dealing with an unknown illness, and the volunteers were falling apart quickly. He didn't have much time to put this puzzle together, so he had called Dr. Sundaralingam for help. Dr. Sundaralingam stopped at the ICU bed nearest the door. A volunteer from the drug trial, named David, so the man sitting next to Rost, was hooked up to a ventilator to help him breathe. David's body was swollen, his blood pressure was very low, and it was clear that his lungs were failing. He was one of the sickest patients that Dr. Sundaralingam had ever seen, and he knew that he would soon see 5 other men in a similar condition. Dr. Sundaralingam ordered a full battery of tests right away, and when the blood work came back, he could see that all 6 patients were going into kidney failure, which could be fatal. Now, obviously, this was a massive problem on its own, but it was a particularly big issue for this hospital, because this hospital didn't have enough dialysis machines to do the kidneys' work for all 6 of these volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam began calling around to different hospitals asking for spare machines, and when he talked to them, he told them to please hurry. Then, Dr. Sundaralingam and his staff got to work trying to stabilize the patient's blood pressure. In all 6 cases, he could see that they were suffering from some kind of blood poisoning that was causing their blood pressures to drop. If it continued, all of them were at risk of more vital organs shutting down. For a moment, the doctor wondered if the trial drug was somehow contaminated. That was the only explanation he could think of that would cause blood poisoning in all 6 volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam looked out the ICU window and saw blue and white ambulance lights zooming up the street. Then he heard commotion in the halls, and he knew that hospital staff were racing dialysis machines up to the ICU. Dr. Sundaralingam knew he needed to get out of the way, which gave him the perfect chance to race down to Dr. Bradford's office. He needed to see every last bit of paperwork they had on this drug, TGN 1412. 30 minutes later, Dr. Sundaralingam stood outside the ICU. He and Dr. Bradford had pored over the paperwork for TGN 1412 until they found a potential diagnosis. They saw that there was an extremely small risk that this drug could trigger an immune reaction known as a cytokine storm. Cytokine storm is extremely dangerous, leading to inflammation, high body temperature, organ failure, and rapid deterioration of healthy body tissues. It is absolutely a life-threatening condition. Now, the 2 doctors began to suspect that the volunteers were suffering cytokine storms right before their eyes. Luckily, there was a treatment for this condition, however, it was very risky. In fact, it presented the doctors with a life-or-death decision. And that's because the doctors were not 100% sure what was making these volunteers sick. It was possible they were suffering from cytokine storms, but they could also be suffering from blood poisoning due to contaminated drugs. And the treatments for those 2 conditions are almost exact opposites. If these men, these volunteers, had a cytokine storm, they would need a high dose of strong drugs to shut down their immune systems. But if this was a blood infection, well, those strong drugs, the immunosuppressant drugs, those would kill them, because their immune systems would now not be able to fight the poison. And there was no way for Dr. Sundaralingam to know for certain which condition was sickening the patients. He just had to make an educated guess and hope that he chose the right course of treatment. However, before making that guess, Dr. Sundaralingam took out his phone and began calling every colleague he trusted. And he walked them through the case, getting as many opinions as possible, because of course there was just no room for error here. If he didn't choose the correct treatment, there was a strong chance all the patients would die. He listened carefully to the advice of his colleagues, and then he knew it was time. It was now after midnight, and the nursing staff was really struggling to keep the patients stable much longer. Dr. Sundaralingam made his decision and ordered the treatment. Around 3:30 a.m. that morning, March 13th, Katrina Oakley's heart was racing as she climbed the hospital steps to the ICU. An hour earlier, her phone had woken her up. She'd purposely left the phone on loud in case her fiancé David called her from the hospital, where he was taking part in a clinical trial. He told her he would be totally safe, but she had still been worried. Except the call that had just woken her up was not a call from David. It was from a nurse asking her to come to the hospital right away. Something had gone wrong during the trial. Within minutes, Katrina had been running out the door. Just outside of the ICU, a nurse met Katrina and warned her that David might look a little different. He was being treated for something called a cytokine storm, which meant he was on a lot of drugs to suppress his immune system. And as a result, those drugs had caused some serious swelling. Katrina swallowed hard, doing her best to stay calm, but feeling very overwhelmed and confused. She had a million questions about David's condition and how any of this could have happened in the first place, but first, she just wanted to see David. She followed the nurse inside of the ICU to David's bedside. And right away, she saw her fiancé's face was so swollen, his eyes were like these little tiny slits, and his cheeks were so puffed up, his head looked like a beach ball. His stomach was also so huge and distended that at first, she thought he was resting his hands on his belly under the blankets. But he wasn't. His hands were by his side, and those too were very puffy. Plus, David's skin now had a yellow tint. Katrina took one of David's hands, and as she did, he turned to look at her, but his eyes were totally glazed over, like he couldn't really see her. Katrina had to fight the impulse to scream. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen to the perfectly healthy young man she had kissed goodbye just the day before. Just after dawn, Dr. Bradford drove into the Northwick Hospital parking lot and found news cameras waiting outside. Dr. Bradford hustled past them into the hospital and flipped on the television he kept in his office. Every channel was now talking about the catastrophic medical trial, calling these sick volunteers the Elephant Men because of how they had all swollen up like balloons. Dr. Bradford ran up the stairs to the ICU, where a nurse told him that 5 of the 6 patients were still in bad shape, but they were stable. However, the 6th patient was continuing to get worse, and in fact, he could die. And later that morning, Dr. Bradford learned that Scotland Yard was now investigating for any signs of foul play in this trial. But no matter how bad Dr. Bradford felt about this, and no matter what actually made these men sick, there really actually was not much Dr. Bradford could do for the patients now. Dr. Sunthuralingam was the intensive care specialist, not Dr. Bradford. So Dr. Bradford just went home, and for the next 2 days, he was glued to the news, checking repeatedly on the condition of the men. And finally, on the 3rd morning, Dr. Bradford learned that all 6 patients almost miraculously had improved overnight, and for the time being, it seemed like they could recover. And so that morning, Dr. Bradford decided to go into the hospital, but when he arrived at his office, he found that the office itself had been sealed off by police. An officer with Scotland Yard explained that the trial bays and his office were now part of a crime scene and off limits until the investigation was over. All Dr. Bradford could do was yet again go back home and wait, as Scotland Yard and British health inspectors conducted their investigation into the trial. But Dr. Bradford didn't really care about the implications of this investigation. All he was focused on was that the patients would pull through. That's all he wanted. And not even for his own sake, but just because he couldn't bear the thought of these volunteers dying because of his clinical trial. It was horrible. Thankfully, Dr. Sunthuralingam had made the right call. The TGN 1412 clinical trial volunteers had all developed cytokine storms, and the immunosuppressive drugs had saved their lives. But while Dr. Bradford was obviously thrilled to learn that all 6 patients would likely pull through, he still had no idea what could have triggered such a rare response to this drug. It would take them months, but the health inspectors would eventually discover why this had happened. It would turn out Dr. Bradford and his team were missing some crucial information, because even though this drug had been successfully tested on animals, those animals weren't capable of experiencing cytokine storms. So even though there was some preliminary clinical research showing that TGN 1412 might trigger cytokine storms in humans, it just had not been on Dr. Bradford's radar. And in the end, it actually was not really the drug that triggered this response. It was just how quickly the drug had been administered. The volunteers had received their entire dose of the drug in just 6 minutes, which actually was 10 times faster than it should have been given. And because Dr. Bradford and his team scheduled each patient's infusion just 10 minutes apart, the staff didn't have enough time to check each patient for immediate side effects before infusing the next patient. Had the drug been administered more slowly, it almost certainly would have been less of a shock to the system, and the cytokine storm likely would not have been triggered. On the morning of Tuesday, March 20th, about 9 days after the start of this trial, 4 of the 6 trial patients had improved enough to be transferred out of the ICU. But their immune systems were so depleted that they had to stay in the hospital for another 2 weeks. David Oakley made a full recovery in time for his wedding to Katrina. However, one volunteer, named Ryan, developed pneumonia, septicemia, and dry gangrene. As a result of the gangrene, his fingertips fell off, and part of his foot had to be amputated. As for Rost, he never got sick for one reason. He was the only person in his group to receive the placebo dose rather than the actual drug. As he watched the story of the Elephant Men unfold on national news, he knew he'd truly dodged a bullet. Eventually, David and some of the other trial volunteers who had gotten sick decided to file a lawsuit against Parexel, the company running the trial, and in 2009, they received an out-of-court settlement. In the wake of this failed medical trial, medical regulators made 22 recommendations to improve the safety of clinical trials, and these standards now apply throughout Europe. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plouffe. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zair. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.